Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be able to sit down, virtually, of course, with two very distinguished panelists, the Honorable David Burt, the Premier of Bermuda, and Chamath Palihapitiya, the founder and CEO of Social Capital. Thank you both for joining me in this conversation. Premier Burt, let me start with a question for you, if I might. If there is a silver lining for the business world and for business, rather, in the global pandemic, it's that there has been this acceleration of the transition to truly connected workforces. I know we're going through this at Fortune, and I imagine you are as well in many of your businesses there. How has Bermuda helped facilitate this digital transformation for businesses in the territory?
Well, I would say, well, first of all, Clifton, it's a pleasure to be here in Chamath. It's also good to join you as well. I think that the way in which we are trying to facilitate that is, number one, and the best thing to do is be a safe place where people can come, visit, live, and work. And that's certainly something of which we've seen in Bermuda as well. But I think from a broader perspective, our view with digital assets is that we want to recognize, we want to make sure that Bermuda is a home and a center for innovation for digital assets. And the more that we allow our country, in my view, to be used as a place for innovation to happen, I think that will certainly help to make, I would say, advance the digital asset revolution. So, I mean, with connected workforces, as we are looking where we are here in Bermuda, we see that there are certainly global companies that are from that are located here in Bermuda, but we've also seen other local companies our international companies bring some of their staff here to Bermuda because it is a safe environment to work during a pandemic. So I would say the remote working has worked for us as well, attracting people, remote workers to Bermuda, and as well as our international companies, knowing that they have persons in places like London or New York, which are probably not the friendliest of places to be right now. And so they are looking to migrate those persons to Bermuda.
You know, safe, secure, and beautiful, Bermuda kind of has that covered. But, you know, one of the amazing things about this digital transformation and digital connection is that it kind of lowers the moat, if you will, in the sense that, you know, anybody can become a digitally connected center for global finance. How does Bermuda maintain its edge as that central node in global finance?
Thanks. I mean, what I call it is a secret sauce Bermuda. So it is I would say the Bermuda Trinity. So it is the government, it is the regulator, and it is industry that work together to make sure that we stay ahead of the trends, which may be there. Bermuda, of course, being a very small country, 65,000 persons. Here, a government that is right next door to the regulator, right next door to industry. It is common to have interactions with high levels of government, high levels of the regulator, and high levels of industry. So we recognize the trends which are happening, and we do our best to adjust very quickly. So whether it was the work remote program, which we're able to implement in a matter of weeks, whether it's other changes that we were able to make very quickly during the pandemic, we have the advantage of being a very nimble jurisdiction. One of our companies that moved here says that our country itself functions as a startup, and I think that that's something that's critically important in today's age.
Well, Chamath, you actually function as a startup too, as someone who has invested in so many of them and gotten them off the ground. You know, much of what the Premier was talking about was also creating a nice regulatory framework or an environment that helps get these companies off the ground and makes Bermuda a place where they'd want to start. How do you see regulatory framework changing over the next couple of years when it comes to things like blockchain and international cash payments or other kinds of digital assets in terms of making them work for securities clearing and asset trading, et cetera?
Well, before I answer this, let me just say, first of all, thanks for including me and obviously Premier Burt for inviting me. I also know him as David. And so, you know, just as a friend, I'm just excited to support him and Bermuda in general. So I'm glad to sort of be here and give you a few of my thoughts. The reality is that we're actually in many ways a little bit of a brave new world. We are going to redefine a lot of bilateral laws. We're going to actually explore a lot of tax treaties now that was really silent on this whole work from home movement. Just to give you one very simple example, in California, where there's a lot of technology companies, it's always been viewed that the company that issues options to employees is doing so in the state of California. And so those options theoretically are vesting to an employee in that state. Now, what happens if that employee starts in that state, but then leaves for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years? California is going to be under a lot of pressure to still make a claim that that taxation revenue is theirs. If you think about that writ large across all of the 50 states in the United States and then all of the countries in the world, and you think about the fiscal pressure that is on governments at all levels because of this pandemic, there are a lot of open questions. And in many ways, I think that if you view that as the sort of like glass half full is the opportunity for countries like Bermuda. Because if you can figure out how to work within corporate governance, understand all of the major touch points and the pain points that are going to be important for companies and CEOs and founders and employees, and work backwards from that to create a jurisdictional framework, I think that you will see a lot of support where companies will, either move people or move their organizations or move their charters into the jurisdictions that are the most progressive and understand how work gets done in the 21st century, or where everybody is scattered to the four winds. And so underneath that is some of obviously the more detailed answers to your questions, but at the highest level, that's what I think the opportunity is right now, because frankly, there's so much confusion, and that confusion, from a startup person creates opportunity.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition to this next question, which is that I've heard you both use the terms transparency and certainty in terms of what really makes a good regulatory framework. Premier, I know this is important to you, and one of the things that you're striving for in the legislature there to sort of create a very clear and certain set of rules that will help companies feel secure about investing there.
Well, Bermuda is, I say that a lot of places like to brag about things. Bermuda, we brag because we're good at regulating. And a lot of people will be like, no, we want to run away from you. But that is the truth. It's our strength. Our strength is regulation.
Gen X kind of boast.
Absolutely. It's weird. It's weird, but it's honest. And so when we look at, for instance, people say, your Bermuda companies are there just, for the tax neutrality. So that's something. Well, a lot of our local insurance companies, which are headquartered here, have elected to be U.S. taxpayers. So it is not necessarily even on the tax side. They want to be in a place where they can have a regulator, which they know they can pick up the phone, that they can call, that they can interact with, and that can actually understand and take time to understand their business and look at it from a risk-based framework versus just, overall, it's one size fits all. So I think that's the unique benefit to what we have in Bermuda. And so making sure that you are transparent so people know and understand what the regulatory environment is, but also providing that clarity so that business can go ahead and grow. So we've done that for financial services as a whole, certainly with insurance, but now in digital assets, we're also doing that as well, because we perceive digital assets as the way of the future. And what we want is for our entrepreneurs in Bermuda to be at the ground level of that business to make sure that they can innovate from here. So we're putting more and more, I guess I would say, licensing classes that are there. So more and more persons can innovate with a regulator who understands and will take time to look at what they're doing.
By the way, the thing that I would say just on top of that for 1 second is that the only reason, not the only reason, but one of the main reasons why this is even possible is because part of what you're getting is this youthfulness, which comes with it an intellectual level of curiosity. I mean, I deal with regulators all around the world. And one thing that I can tell you quite honestly is we are bumping up against a necessary sea change in many political regimes where, the reality is the plurality of people in the world are young. These are people in their 20s and 30s that are kind of like, they want to see some real change. At a minimum, they want to see their elected officials use an iPhone. Sometimes it's not even a very, and so when you have, a young, thoughtful, intellectually curious person like the Premier, and then you have a government like that, you can actually believe that these things can come to pass where somebody will take the time to understand how would you create a framework for digital assets? How would you think about, custody of these kinds of very complicated instruments? And you can see a path forward that in other places you necessarily can't. And so I think that's also part of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Chamath, because there is certainly because we even experienced it here when at the beginning when we were starting with the digital asset industry, and it was persons who I'm going to be pejorative here, and I hope I don't get in trouble, but I called them the graybeards, who were like, no, you can't do that. It's going to tarnish our reputation. And my response was, I said, I am certain we can figure out a way to do this that can work. And if we want to be known as a place for financial services and innovation, it is clear that the digital asset economy is going to be the future. And if we don't do it, then we will be left behind. Now, we made that move 2 years ago. Broadly, I think our Digital Asset Business Act went into force in September 2018. And now we're seeing there additional momentum with more companies that are being licensed, more people that are paying attention to it, and it takes a while to go ahead and build. So you have to, of course, from my perspective, and it's lucky because I just won an election, so I don't have those short-term political pressures, but you have to be able to say, I'm not going to focus on the short-term political pressures, and I'm going to take the long-term view, recognize that this is something that makes sense in the long run.
I want to come back to some of those laws that you passed in 2018. One of them is the initial Coin Offering Act, and the other is this Digital Asset Business Act, DABA. But Chamath, you just raised $2.1 billion for 3 new SPACs, which are special purpose acquisition companies. Where do you see the most promising fintech investment, just in terms of categories? I'm not going to ask you to name companies, although if you want. Where do you see your SPACs taking a big position in terms of that new technologies or categories of technology?
So look, fintech is incredibly interesting, but not without its inherent risk. What I would tell you, broadly speaking, of the category, and specifically within early stage and growing fintech startups, is that you have to really look under the hood in terms of the growth that these companies have seen, and you have to be very thoughtful in the kinds of diligence that you do, because what you see, I think, are 2 different kinds of businesses. There's category A, of which there are a few, that are the slow, methodical, sort of like earn your way in and grow. Category B is sort of, grow at all costs as quickly up front. The problem when you take that second category and you look underneath the hood, what you see are growth mechanisms that are very, in some cases, fast and loose. And what that creates is regulatory uncertainty and pressure, because you have these organizations, especially in America, like the CFPB or, the New York DFS, and, rightfully, they look at companies very carefully. What you also see are some business models where, they are in the data brokering business or the data selling business, no different to, some of the social media companies. And the problem with all of that stuff is that they don't necessarily result in sustainable enterprise value. Now, if you take that filter away and just say, well, assume there are only these category 1 companies that grow thoughtfully in a kind of like morally defensible long-term way, I think there are some incredible businesses in wealth management. I think that there are some incredible businesses in cryptography and, sort of like crypto assets. I do think that there are some incredible business in unlocking what is this huge trend in the world now, which is financializing everything. Meaning, you can now buy not just a share of a company via a stock or a share of a piece of debt via a bond. You can buy a piece of a running shoe, a piece of a baseball card, a piece of a car, a piece of a bottle of wine, a piece of a cash flow stream of a company. These are things that 5 years ago, you would never have been able to buy in any scale. So those, to me, are the really interesting businesses. You just have to very carefully diligence them and qualify them to make sure that they are growing in a thoughtful, morally and legally defensible way.
So, Premier Burt, what's your best pitch right now to Chamath to get him to invest in Bermuda businesses? You've got lots of wealth management businesses. You've got a crypto asset industry growing, and you've got lots of efforts to tokenize or financialize virtually everything. Make your pitch.
Oh boy, you put me on the spot there, Cliff. To Chamath, I would say that there are a number of companies that are inside of our ecosystem. Chamath is familiar with some of them, certainly already. And the fact is that it is a place for innovation. And so it's not necessarily to invest in the companies that are here, but it's persons like Chamath, other venture capitalists who actually are looking at companies and have ideas that are brought to them and say, you know what, you could actually take this idea off if you were to go to Bermuda and if you were to go under their regulatory environment, because they have a unique set of circumstances there that you can actually test this out and then scale it up to the rest of the world. So I think that's the play. And that's actually the angle of which we're looking to make sure that we continue to make those type of connections. Because a lot of times people are just uncertain. They don't know about the options that are there. And that's why it's the continued outreach and making sure that we have the examples and basically share what you're able to do underneath our regulatory environment.
Yeah, in fact, to build on that, it's actually, the Premier's already convinced me. I was there in a small way. I'm now there in a much more meaningful way. So he's already kind of gotten me there. And more important than that, I've actually started to look at different ways of standing up some businesses that I think Bermuda specifically, this pandemic has actually really highlighted some real gaps, for example, in insurance that exist, at the corporate and business level. And these are businesses that I'm looking at standing up. And to the extent that I do, the offshore domicile will be probably in Bermuda.
So, Premier Burt, you're not only the youngest premier in Bermuda history, but more importantly, you were a double major in finance and information systems at George Washington University, which seems like a wonderful sort of background for this next question, which is that, you created this digital token or at least a pilot program where Bermuda can try to stimulate the economy in the wake of the COVID slowdown. Talk a little bit about that program, because it is really unusual.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. I mean, for us, we want to be that center of innovation. And so what this was, it was done through a local company, not a local company, sorry, one of our international companies who has an office here, who is licensed by the Bermuda Monetary Authority to provide and conduct a digital asset business. And they came to us with the idea. And that's what the government of Bermuda does. They will take a company that's inside of our ecosystem and say, we want to do that, and we will support them in demonstrating that product. So it works for us, because one of the things in which we found during the pandemic, it was difficult to get relief payments out to persons. Not everyone has a bank account. And so we had issues where there were checks, and there were actually issues where we literally need to find out how to get cash payments to people, which is just completely outside of the regular financial instructions of the government. But when you have people who need to have access to funds because they are unable to, to survive, and that's what you have to do, especially if the government has put in severe mitigation efforts to slow the spread of the virus. So in that case and instance, this was something where we were able to demonstrate that we could go to certain vendors, that we can use money and partner with a private sector company to show how this can work. And our view is to expand that, but not only to say that it is just this player, but if there are other companies that want to come through to demonstrate how these tokens can work, to partner with the government, we are more than happy to do that, because what we're trying to make ourselves to be not locked into any particular vendor, not locked into any particular standard, but looking at the broader standard, which is what in Bermuda we call the currency standard, which is there's going to be a lot of interoperability between various places of exchange. And we want to be that place where that exchange can go ahead and happen. So if you look at the innovation that's happened in Bermuda already, I mean, we have the first, I think, actually listed Bitcoin ETF, which is going on a Bermuda Stock Exchange. We have a number of things of which we're piloting and innovating. And so from that perspective, we welcome companies into the space to move on with that. So we're looking forward to that pilot. It's going to certainly be expanding as we go forward. And when we look at the way and how we can go ahead and push out programmable money to more places, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating when you can basically say that you're going to design this token, and this token, if you don't spend the money, you lose it. You can actually create certain financial incentives for people to participate inside of your economy.
That brings up the term de-risking. Chamath, in the effort to develop vaccines and therapeutics against COVID, and I know you're a big health tech investor, we've been hearing that word a lot, de-risking. Government agencies like BARDA in the United States, the Biological Advanced Research and Development Agency, help spur these innovative but risky drug development programs by providing risk capital, or in some cases by pre-buying product. And we've also seen philanthropic groups like the Gates Foundation de-risk some of these entrepreneurial initiatives in everything from malaria drugs to cutting edge toilets. Yeah. So where would you like to see some government help, if at all, to de-risk some of the investments that we're going to need from startup entrepreneurs or others that could potentially change the world?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of early risk capital from the government. I don't think that that's what they're good at. They're good at governing and governance. And so I really do believe in sort of specialization where people should find something that they're good at and kind of, stay in that swim lane, because then you can maximize the results of the overall system. And that's also true for companies and, for individuals inside of companies, et cetera, et cetera. If I had to sort of pick two things, I think where the government can be exceptionally leveraged in spurring innovation. Number one is to loosen and create a more supportive regulatory framework. And so in the specific case of healthcare, I think that pathway has to do with how you can get approvals to start trials. Two is the way in which you can take those trials on so that you don't necessarily have to have, these multi-hundred person trials cost many billions of dollars. You can still have multi-hundred person trials, but they can cost a lot less if the rules were different. Mm-hmm. How you can get those to market, how you can make sure that people who want to try and have access to these things get them available. We saw this actually in the last few weeks with President Trump. He got Regeneron via a compassionate use authorization. Then the presidency passed an executive order to allow emergency use authorization. It's still not something an average citizen can walk into a hospital and expect to get. And so creating a regulatory framework that's more supportive of experimentation, I think, is key. And then you said another thing, which I think is incredibly important, which is these offtake agreements. And so to the extent that you can be a small company who's entrepreneurial, who's building an innovative solution, having the government as the first buyer, and not the last buyer, not the middle buyer, but the first buyer via an offtake agreement is very empowering because it catalyzes other investor interest. So that's what I would focus on if I was a government in healthcare, but frankly, broadly writ large, is deregulate or create a more sustainable regulatory framework for experimentation and combine it with government balance sheet use for offtake agreements.
Premier, one of the things that sort of stands out, as you pointed out, about Bermuda's regulatory environment is this stability and security and reputation, for being so. As an international center for finance, that's critical. But Chamath really just talked about sort of encouraging risk taking and sort of probing, allowing things that explore this brave new world to sort of take hold and not be squelched by some sort of new regulation that comes to, quote, protect the world. How do you balance that? Because that seems like a fundamental challenge for any government.
You balance it by making sure that you listen and are thoughtful in your approach. And Bermuda has just done a very good job of balancing that over the years. And so when I say that regulation is our calling card, that's where it comes from. It comes from our ability to look at a problem and to say, this is how we can address this, working with industry so we can design sensible regulation that stands up to international scrutiny, but also allows companies to, as Chamath said, be able to innovate, because that is key. And so there's a reason why Bermuda is called the world's risk capital. There's a reason why companies out in Silicon Valley and others look to us and come to Bermuda at first for insurance to say, how do we manage these risks? And it is a place where the market is here, where we have persons who are risk professionals who can assist in that. So we are continuing to evolve to new lines of risk through all various items. So now, of course, even in the digital asset industry, where we have companies inside of our ecosystem that are providing insurance inside of that space, we will continue to innovate in that area. So I think that it's exciting for Bermuda, because if you look at financial services, one of the keys are risk management. How does insurance fit into any type of business. And whatever business it is that you're doing, you need to make sure that you have carefully managed those risks, especially with technology. And that's what I think the Bermuda market helps. So we take what we do there and we apply it to new areas. So we were able to come up with regulation for the digital asset industry relatively easily. And we did it based upon our experience previously in knowing how to make sensible regulation that doesn't have a one-size-fits-all model, but basically takes a risk-based approach.
6 years ago, Fortune started something called the Change the World list, which really focuses on companies that are doing well by doing good, and recognizing that the for-profit enterprise is often the best vehicle for creating social change, because it not only follows the sort of rules of business and the accountability of business, but it can be both sustainable through the profit motive and also scalable. And so you recognize the power of something like that. Chamath, this brings me to social capital, the venture fund you began nearly a decade ago to address some key societal, environmental, and even biological problems, from cancer to climate change. First, talk a little bit about how that impact-focused investment fund works differently from other VC funds. And since this is a fintech-focused conference, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how your financial services portfolio companies are particularly excited about changing the world, if you will.
Well, when I first started the business, I was solely focused on sort of things that could really advance society, solving incredibly hard problems. But then I realized that if I go out of business, then all of that goes to zero. And there was a lot of investing that I did up front, which was really about keeping the lights on, because I needed to generate returns, because I needed to make sure that my investors didn't lose confidence in me. And I was lucky enough to do enough of that to give me the permission to do the real kind of investing that I really loved and that I felt that was sorely needed in the world. And by 2016, we had been successful enough where I could essentially transition out some of these investors, in fact, all of them, and focus on my own capital, because it was large enough at that point where we could really then do our job in an uninterrupted fashion. But to be honest, I was very traditional for many years, because I just, had I focused on, cancer and space exploration out of the box, I would not have seen the returns in 2010. I do see a line of sight to those returns in 2019 and 20 and 21. So I feel like we're in a really good place, but you have to sort of bridge the timing. So that's how I started. And, now I'm in a position where I can really compound aggressively, doing these big kind of ideas that I think really matter. In terms of fintech, what I really believe the future looks like is, number one is more of this, again, financialization, the creating incremental certificates and units and ownership quantum of all kinds of different things that approximate money. And approximate is the right word, because the reality is that, you don't need money. In fact, money in a world of zero rates is actually quite a problem. What you want is to actually own things that are compounding. And in my opinion, what you want to have are ownership in things where there is a capital allocator at the helm that is putting that money to work on our behalf in better and better uses. And it is not true if rates were at 10, 12, 13%, but it is absolutely true when rates are zero or negative. So, my focus now is trying to find how to create financial assets out of things that don't look financial, that generate a return so that the CEO can then aggressively reinvest those returns on our behalf, and so that we can own a unit of that appreciation. That's number one. And then number two, I really want to democratize access to those returns. The reality is that, a very, very small number of people have benefited over the last 20 to 30 years of what is essentially rates going from 7% to zero. And essentially from a balance sheet that was manageable, when you look at sort of monetary policy, to now balance sheets that basically outnumber total GDP by a multitude and multiples of it. So in that world, why should not the ordinary person, American, citizen of Bermuda, Canadian, have access to returns? How do they make sure that they have a viable lifestyle? How do they make sure they have a viable ability to pay for their children's healthcare or education, have a decent retirement. And so that's my goal. Is I'm spending a lot of time now investing in businesses that can theoretically change the world, can theoretically financially approximate returns, but I really want to make that accessible to every single person. I don't like working on behalf of rich people anymore. Not super motivating.
and Chamath, you make an excellent point, because that's what a lot of people don't get when it comes to power. When we talk about fintech, people are like, oh, it's just this broad topic and all the rest. But it allows for, for if myself as a leader of a country want to give a share of a PPP to every single person in the country, we have the ability to do that now easily, whereas before it would have been a far more complex way about doing things. And that's, I think, the total vision. It's about making sure that people actually have that ownership stake, become more owners in small things where they can accumulate a small item. Someone had come with me an idea and said, for a dividend for Bermuda, you should basically do, 1/10 of 1% of every company that incorporates has to put something into for the population of the country so your people can own something. And it goes along those type of lines. So what Chamath is saying in regards to the financialization of everything and the ability to break those ownership stakes up, I think that is going to be the big promise of what fintech is certainly going to be able to deliver. And of course, there's a lot of companies that are building that technology, going through to make sure they can bring it to market. And I think that, like what Chamath has said, that's certainly a very exciting thing, which we'll see.
In addition to this democratization of investment, there has been another movement afoot for the last, several years on this idea of the corporation as serving multiple stakeholders, not just the shareholder. And we've seen a real movement towards that, not just in the Business Roundtable, but in stuff that Fortune has done and the conversations we keep having with CEOs and other leaders. Do you see that happening with businesses in Bermuda as well? And is this something that you're actually encouraging in terms of the sort of global enterprise of businesses that congregate in Bermuda?
Well, absolutely. It's something that we're encouraging. And I mean, you have to encourage it from the top level as well. So, I mean, from our perspective, we are certainly, from the Bermuda perspective, we want to be known as a leading place to do business. And so that means that we have to keep up not only with the global trends, but also in cases we have to lead. And I think the leadership position has to certainly be from the government. So just recently won an election, and some of the things which we spoke about in election manifesto is, to make sure that the country itself as a whole is more fair. And so that means that more people need to be able to participate in the economy.
Chamath, I want to sort of radically go different here. You've had a sort of side career as a poker player in the past. Yeah, I want to see this poker face. I wasn't expecting you to smile here, but you do have to sort of make some bets, when you're doing this and bluff a little bit. What is the sort of wild bet that you're willing to take with your investments?
Well, I mean, look, you have to take I think what poker teaches, well, at least it has taught me, is about this portfolio theory approach. You have to view, let's just say you play for 2 hours or 3 hours. There's, let's say, 50 or 100 hands. Some go well, some go poorly, some you sit out, right? Some you have the absolute best of it coming in and you lose. Some you have the absolute worst of it and you win by sheer luck. And so there's a broad set of outcomes, and what it trains you is to be really even keeled through all of it. And so, when I think about my investing life, I apply the same philosophy. So I have a few very large bets every year that I like to make, a few $100 million to $1 billion bets, 1 or 2, no more. And then I have many, many, many small bets, and in this case now our capital base has grown where those small bets are, $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 million, but I can make 50 or 100 of them a year, almost one every 2 or 3 days. And I can be very unemotional about them because they're about learning. And so I use all of those bets as ways of trying to acquire information to understand where the world is going. And then I refine that to make 1 or 2 very, very large bets on the future where I think the time is right for a certain kind of change. And so, in this early stage bucket, there's all kinds of crazy things. For example, we're working on this idea of a very specific kind of inert bacteria, where that bacteria does not cause any illness, it does not cause sickness, and you can put it into the oceans and it will eat plastic. Now, do I know that that will work? No. But do we know about the negative impacts of plastic in our oceans? And, I mean, Bermudans can probably very much understand the impacts of climate change firsthand, because they were not meaningful contributors to it, but they do suffer in many ways because of what's happened in other economies and the amount of carbon that's been emitted. When you look at sort of fish stocks and the ability to feed our populations, if you've ever gone swimming in the oceans and you come up and there's a piece of plastic on your head, you know what I'm talking about. So, there are all kinds of these crazy ideas. We've been working on a different idea, which is a kind of a very overlooked mechanism that can actually get through the blood-brain barrier. And so, if you look at every single drug in Alzheimer's, they failed. Every single one, 100% of them have failed. Which, by the way, just a funny story. I think it was like Martha Stewart or somebody else that went to jail for betting on the success of an Alzheimer's drug, and it turned out to be insider trading. It's the last thing you should ever do. You should just always bet against an Alzheimer's drug. They all fail. Now, joking aside, part of it is just getting through this blood-brain barrier, and then being able to target sort of what's actually happening inside the brain. And there are now some very innovative things that have been proven to actually effectively get through the blood-brain barrier. So, I spend $3, $4, $5, $10 million putting small teams on the ground in a position to try to find these things, because I think if it works, on the off chance they work, it's incredible. Meanwhile, one or two very concentrated bets over here to essentially keep the lights on and keep the whole thing afloat.
Chamath, you're the only one I've ever met who follows blood-brain barrier with a funny story.
But Cliff, Chamath, that could not have been the first time that you have compared your life in investing to a poker game.
No, I think the Premier and I first connected because both of us we have a lot of shared experiences. But one of them is sort of like having this longitudinal view of where you are in your journey, and poker is about that exact journey playing out every single 2 minutes per hand. Right? It's the rise, the fall, sometimes you rise again. And it really teaches you to be okay with the outcome and focus on a process.
Premier, Chamath mentioned climate change and the challenge, of course, you oversee an island nation. And clearly, not just in terms of the plastics problem that Chamath mentioned, but rising sea levels are a constant threat, and getting more so every day. How has your government started to pivot towards addressing this?
Sustainability is important. And so in all factors in future planning, we need to think about what world will be where the sea levels will be higher. Bermuda is fortunate because we are not an entirely low-lying country. So, a lot of our land masses are higher than sea level, significantly higher. And there are some spaces which are below sea level, which we, of course, will have to work with and mitigate over time. But I think that the most important thing of which we can do is certainly plan for that, because resilience is important going forward. Sustainability is certainly important going forward, but we have to just be a part of the global voice to say that there are certainly going to be places which will be far more negatively impacted. And so if you're looking at the United States, or if you're looking at China, the fact is that I can assure you that the state of Florida will be far more affected than rising sea levels than will the island of Bermuda. And from us, when we look at and approximate what that looks like, it's not that bad for us, but it certainly is a challenge that we are having to make sure that we make our future planning. So when we're talking about, a major infrastructure investment, the major infrastructure investment that is supposed to last for 50 years, we take into account if it is an area that may be prone in the future to flooding, then we're going to go ahead and make sure that we take the extra work and investment to raise that. But our capital city here in Hamilton is certainly well above sea level. We don't normally get flooding here, and there are certain areas that are near creeks where some of our budget items actually and some of our stimulus money is actually going to be spent in remediating those as well. So I think it's important for that to make sure that you make the future capital investments resilient to climate change.
You know, you just mentioned the expression global voice, and it's hard not to sort of notice the fact, talking to both of you, that there has been a generational change in the global voice and in global leadership. Both of you are millennials. I'm sorry, Gen Xers.
Oh boy.
You're both in your early 40s. And we're seeing this sort of change in leadership, not just in industry, but in government around the world. How has your younger generation, basically help shape your thinking in terms of the kinds of problems that have to be addressed?
You have to be surrounded by these new voices. I mean, I don't think it's at the exclusion of people that that are older than us. I think the Premier and I both will probably tell you that we've been lucky to have incredible mentors. They've supported us and have really paved the way, and they're still there when we call them. But you really need to talk to young people because they have as it turns out, an incredibly different worldview than many of us about the nature of work, about the nature of success, about the nature of social responsibility. And so you just have to understand where they're going. And the good news is, they can reflect those views now in people like the Premier. You see, some really incredible emerging leaders in the Nordics, young, vibrant people. And that to me is really exciting. I think the United States is sort of at the tail end of getting ready for all of that. With this election, you can see it, but to me, it's everything. Is you want a diversity of folks, but you really should be talking to these young folks because I think they're wired very, very differently than the rest of us are.
And Premier, the same question for you.
Well, Chamath had said something very interesting, that young people have almost a different view and vision of the frame of success. And it's an example of which I think was interesting, something which I learned recently during our election campaign, when there was this thing that was put out in regards to home ownership. It even goes to some young people don't even consider that as important as their parents did, and they're looking for other veins and avenues of success. So I think what Chamath has said in two ways. Number one, certainly we are blessed to have the counsel of others, but it is very, very important, I think, to listen to the next generation to make sure that political leaders and also business leaders are in touch with with whom you are basically selling your product to. Because as you get young people more and more involved, and as we get older and older, as what would you call this generation? What did you call this?
Gen X. Yeah.
Gen X. As we move on to the millennials and the other ones that certainly follow, if we are not in touch with what it is they're doing, that will lead to social dislocation. And we're seeing some of that social dislocation in places where the needs are not necessarily being responded to. So in Bermuda, I take that, I'm closer to it as a younger person, but I also recognize that certainly even my frame is different than the frame of those persons who are half my age, who actually view me, even being the youngest Premier in the country's history, as being disconnected to their needs and their views. So it's important for leaders both in business and of course in government to make sure they go ahead and to look at what it is that they want and tailor their strategies towards that.
Well, that was some very insightful framing from both of you. The Honorable David Burt and Chamath Palihapitiya, I want to thank you both for a great conversation.
Thank you.